Welcome everyone. Thanks for your patience there. Thanks for joining us as well. This is the first of a series of panel discussions that have been organized around a broad theme, and you can see the theme there on the screen. Can mining make the world a greener place? And this particular panel session is going to be about where can we find metals, and more on that in the moment. And just a few seconds, but just to introduce myself, I'm the moderator for you today. I'm Ian Stewart. I'm Professor of Geoscience Communication at the University of Plymouth in the UK, and I'll be leading through a kind of stellar cast of experts. This is the first webinar, and there's a workshop, a number of them to come. We've got one later on, can mining be safe and sustainable, and then one on future shape of mining, and one tomorrow on prospects of a circular economy. But you're joining us for a session called Where Can We Find Metals? And you'll see just on the screen there that this is under the banner really of two EU Horizon 2020 projects. So the starting point really in this one is looking at the European realm, and then how the ramifications of that further out. So we're really looking at whether Europe can or should produce more mineral products that it consumes. What's the societal, environmental arguments for more domestic production, and what are the implications for that further afield, particularly in developing countries? So to answer that, we've brought together this panelist that you can see in front of you. In a minute, we're going to hear from Karen Haghold, who's director of the British Geological Survey, and Karen's going to give us a keynote that basically provides a provocation. Karen is, as I say, joined the British Geological Survey relatively recently from EIT Raw Materials, and had a previous role as head of department at the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland, as well as some research roles at Woods Hole, Columbia, and she's broadly a consultant to the mineral exploration industry. You'll see also there Olivier Vidal, who is CNRS Director of Research in Grenoble. His research mainly focuses on the link between energy and raw materials, and he's particularly also in modeling of past and future demand for raw materials and for energy. He was scientific coordinator of the European Network or Industrial Processing of Non-Energy Raw Materials. We then have Georgette Barnes-Sakiado, and she's a mining entrepreneur. She established her own local mining and exploration company. She's also currently president of the Association of Women in Mining in Africa, and a global inspirational women in mining, as voted by Women in Mining UK, a female entrepreneur of the year by Invest in Africa, and someone who champions SMEs across Africa, but she's based in Ghana. We then have Steve Edwards, and Steve Edwards came to us originally way back at University of Idaho, a master's there, but really worked for many years at Conservation International, which is a not-for-profit organization looking about sustainably caring for nature and the environment and the biodiversity. He's now senior program manager for global business and biodiversity at IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and he particularly works there is the lead on engagement with the extractives sector. And then last but not least, we've got Kwasi Ampofo, and Kwasi is a metals and mining analyst at Bloomberg NEF, based in London. His expertise is in battery metals, digitalization, and renewable energy investment in emerging markets. Prior to joining Bloomberg NEF, he was mining engineer at Anglo American, and he's been a management consultant at Noose Group in Australia. So we've got that broad panel, which we'll hear about in a moment. But first of all, we're going to hear a 15-minute kind of provocation, setting the scene. And so for that, I'll pass over to Karen.
Thank you very much, Ian. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to introduce this panel. Let me just start with sharing my screen here. So, can mining make the world a greener place? And with the subtitle for this panel is sort of, where can we find the metals? And I'm not necessarily sure I'm going to talk so much about exactly where we find the metals, but why we need to find the metals, and also why we find them where we do, why we tend to mine them in the places that we do. And I've been asked to give sort of a slightly European angle to this, because one of the questions that we'll be debating later on is this thing, should Europe be actually mining more in Europe? So Why do we mine? That's very easily answered by pretty much by this slide here. We mine because we use minerals and metals for almost everything that we surround ourselves with in our lives, in our homes, in our infrastructure, our transportation, and importantly also in our energy technologies. So this is sort of the one explanation for why we need to think about mining and why we need to think about where we actually go and find these things so that we can have them in our lives. And when we look at where we mine, this is a picture from, or sort of a graph showing the sort of historical proportion of mining, of production of metals and minerals from different regions across the world. And it goes back to about 1850. And if you can see here on the left, you have Europe in the stippled light blue line. And so you go back 150 years, Europe was the main mineral producer globally. Europe was overtaken by the United States around 1900, and then from around 1970 or so, a lot of other regions come in and take sort of their proportion of the production. Basically, when you look at today, out on the right-hand side, you see again Europe as now the lowest producer in the world. We produce maybe something like 3 to 5% of the global production of metals and minerals. And quite interestingly, we actually consume something probably like 25 to 30%. So we are a very large consumer of metals and minerals in Europe. The European industries are using lots and lots of this, but we're importing almost all of it today. On sort of top of this trend here of it maybe a more sort of diversified is also the thing of demand. Are we actually seeing an increasing demand? We are, and there's sort of several reasons that we're seeing an increasing demand on a global level for metals and minerals. And so basically, if you look at world population, it's going up. And so that's a very sort of simple reason for us needing more raw materials of various kinds. There's going to be more people in the future and more people who want more things. And this figure illustrates that as well, because there's a very large growing middle class across the globe, or around the globe. And so basically, we are not just becoming more and more people, we're actually using more and more per person. And again, this figure goes back to about 1900s. It's a study out of Yale University, Thomas Gradle. And what you can basically see on the right-hand side are sort of several different metals and how much we're using today on a logarithmic scale compared to how much we were using back in 1900. And as you can see, for several of them, zinc, copper, nickel, chrome, aluminum, we're using many, many times more than we actually were 100 years ago, at the same time as we are many more people. So this is one of the things that is driving demand. Quite importantly, what's also driving increasing demand is increasing technology. And this is hugely important right now. And it's perhaps maybe always been one of the main drivers for how we have approached raw materials. So we go all the way back to the Stone Age. We just used pretty much flint. And then as our technologies are becoming more and more advanced, we use more and more raw materials. And so basically today we find ourselves on the right-hand side of this diagram using pretty much the entire periodic table. And we're using a lot of that in quite advanced technologies and especially technologies related to energy. And so this is a very big trend. And as we know, across the entire world, and certainly in Europe, we are talking about a Green Deal, we're talking about net zero, and these are all sort of important things and important drivers for how we are consuming or using our raw materials today. So basically this slide sort of summarizes that. We are wanting to move from a brown economy to a green economy, using less hydrocarbons, but at the same time using more of the metals that we need for wind turbines, for solar panels, for batteries, for storing the energy that we're trying to produce when the sun is shining and when the wind is actually blowing. So basically, these energy technologies are driving several metals and minerals demands. And this figure here shows two figures from, or two graphs from the World Bank 2018 report about the mineral intensity in the clean energy transition. And basically you have on the left-hand side here, you have 17 metals and minerals. And then up on the top, you have the different energy technologies that these metals or minerals are critically important to. And there's a sort of wide variety. You can see, you look at, for instance, at lithium, it's really just important for energy storage, but it's hugely important for energy storage. And some of the other metals, for instance, copper, is important for every single one of them, because whenever you want to do anything that involves electricity or energy, you're going to need copper for transportation of that energy. So these are sort of the technologies they go into, and this is the World Bank prediction of how this will affect the demand relative to 2018. So fairly sort of recent usage. And basically you can see, for instance, again, lithium here, we are expecting then that before 2050, we're going to see an increase between 400 and 500%. And the same is the case for graphite and cobalt, pretty much. And then some of the other metals, it's less of an increase in demand, but for many of them, it is by far more than a doubling of the demand that we expect to see between now and 2050. And as one of the examples of that was the, as I mentioned, it was lithium. So we'll just look a little bit deeper on the lithium here. You can see on the left-hand side, the mine production of lithium. This is from BGS data. And what you can see is that in the last just few years, that the production is really going up very, very quickly. And what you can see on the right is, again, a prediction, sort of looking forward a little bit. So you can see 15, you can see 18, and you can see the prediction now to 2030. And what you can see is basically two different scenarios for how much we think that the lithium may increase in the next 10 years. This is only 10 years. And the steps scenario is basically looking at how much would the demand change if we have the current policies that we have now for how we approach the energy transition. And as you can see, it's quite a large increase. The SDS, that is Sustainable Development Scenario. So that's actually the sort of predicted demand if we were going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, which actually, coincidentally, we will, or we would like to, for sure. This is something that we all committed to, that we're going to try to reach these goals by 2030. And that means that for some minerals, we'll see this very, very steep increase in demand. And for a lot of the not so special metals, we will see an increase that will just sort of follow these technologies as sort of support metals and minerals, if you will. And again, looking at Sustainable Development Goals, there are many of them. There are very many of them where actually metals and how we get our metals are going to be very important for achieving them. I mentioned affordable clean energy, decent work economic growth, industry innovation, infrastructure, sustainable cities, responsible consumption, and of course, the climate actions. So these things will actually be important. So before the debate or the discussion, let me just sort of switch a little bit to the question of where do we find it then? Where do we find the metals and minerals? Well, this is a map I downloaded just a few days ago from the USGS website. And this shows the sort of main or major mineral deposits globally. And as you can see, we actually find metals and minerals, maybe not everywhere, but certainly across all continents and across all countries. Different colors here have different symbols. So yes, there is a geological, of course, aspect to this. You're going to find things where they're geologically available, but they are geologically available in many different places across the world. But what about Europe? You can see Europe here. It's pretty good. There's actually quite a lot of things there as well. And if we zoom in on that, this is a figure from ProMine, a Framework 7 project that ran a few years back. Here you can see the main mineral deposits of Europe. And again, we see that there actually are deposits all over Europe. And this is today. This is not in 1850. So this is even, this is how it looks, even though we actually used to mine quite a lot of our resources. So we have still a lot of available resources across Europe. Again, different colors and symbols here signify what exactly it is that is available in these different parts of Europe. So if we have the available resources in Europe, why are we only actually producing as little as maybe 3 to 5%? And for some metals, nothing. Basically, we look at mining a little bit more carefully. This is sort of the, you see the life cycle of a mine, a life cycle of mining, and many different things goes into this. And if we can start here in the middle with license to operate and remediation, then you have mine planning, mapping, surveying, excavation, crushing, transport, infrastructure, and the monitoring of everything, the maintenance, the safety, water, energy, waste tailings, environment and mine conditions, and of course the actual management and performance, sort of financial performance, which feeds back into whether you have the license to operate, if all of these things are going the way they're supposed to be going. So in Europe, we actually have quite a lot of expertise in all these areas, perhaps because we have been a mining region, a very active mining region. We're exporting this kind of expertise and the machinery to mine across the globe. We have the resources. So with the resources, with the skill, with the demand, why aren't we actually mining in Europe? And to be sort of a little bit provocative here before the debate, my answer to that is probably we just don't want to. We don't want to mine in our backyard. So basically, we can zoom in on this license to operate part of the value chain here. We don't really have the license to operate in Europe. There are too many people. We think it's too dirty, and we don't actually want to have the mine right there. And so this is a quite interesting aspect of, I think, the sort of European ethos here. And if you just, this is my last slide, if we look at the entire raw materials value chain, so in Europe, we do very little of the mining. That also means we're doing very little of the exploration, but we're doing some of the downstream things. We like to do the processing, and we definitely like to do the product. We like to build cars and produce different types of things. And of course, the users are here. We have the demand. We want to have things that include metals and minerals in our lives. And so interestingly, I think, is that, of course, in a value chain like this, what typically happens is that the further along that value chain you get, the greater value you're creating. And so in Europe, perhaps we've become so rich that we're deciding we don't actually want to do the very first part of the value chain, and we're most interested in the middle part and maybe the last part. And I think that if I can send us off to the debate with sort of one last thought here, it is that for us to be truly sustainable globally, we need to take responsibility for this value chain wherever we live and whoever we are. So also in Europe, we need to take responsibility for this, perhaps meaning that we explore and mine in the places where it makes sense to explore and mine, where it's sustainable, where it has the least environmental impact, the least societal impact in a negative way. And we also take responsibility for what we actually are using and consuming. And hopefully we can get also the producers of things, the producers of cars and computers and telephones, to take responsibility for the sourcing of the metals and minerals, but also for the recycling, so that we can perhaps get a greater contribution from secondary resources as we move forward. Although I think we do have to acknowledge that with an increasing demand, we do need to get things into this loop, and we do have to do that in the best possible way. So with that, I'm just going to show a pretty picture here from a palladium and gold deposit in East Greenland, and then I'm going to stop sharing and give back to Ian. Thank you.
Hi, Karen. Thank you very much for that beautifully eloquent and very clear exposition there. And I'd like to invite onto the panel then Georgette and Kwasi and Steve and Olivier, and pick these points up. While I do that, just if I can encourage you, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen there, you'll see. If you want to ask a question to the panel, pop your question in there. We've got Tobias and Nick, conveners, sitting behind there, who'll feed some questions through. I'll try to drop them in where relevant. But I think, first of all, following on from that provocation from Karen, I'd like to kind of see what our panel thinks about that take, the same view. I think I'd like to start with Olivier, just following on a little bit that European dimension around supply and demand, and the problem that Karen pointed out there. And alongside, she alluded to, or she mentioned, the Green Deal. The European Green Deal is something that's setting the agenda, certainly in terms of where technology is going, maybe not so much in terms of where the resource to back it up is. But Olivier, do you want to, what's your take on what Karen's outlined? Do you agree with it, or are there areas that you would kind of enhance or kind of rein back from?
No, I definitely agree with Karen's talk and the idea that it's quite important to foster um, metal productions in Europe. However, there is one point that Karen did not mention, which is, I think, quite important, and this is the economic dimension and the economic constraint. I mean, of course, mining in Europe is good because it can only be done with the best practices and technologies that will ensure that to minimize the environmental and social impact. However, the production in developed countries must be competitive with foreign production from countries with lower environmental standards and regulation, less exigent working conditions, or lower wages. And for this reason, I'm afraid that an economically viable production in Europe with the best technologies can be done for sure in places where we have already a mining infrastructure which is active. And in this location, an effort must be made to produce all possible byproduct rare metals, which are actually the metals of concern to the European industry. On the other hand, opening new mines in areas with no existing infrastructure may be more difficult. Well, in fact, it is quite risky to invest in new mines without the assurance that the demand will remain stable in the future or will continue to grow. And for this reason, before thinking to open a new mine, it's also important to estimate the future demand. And Karen showed some estimates which are sound, of course, but we should keep in mind that the demand is evolving very fast, or can evolve very fast in the future, especially the demand in rare metals, because the technologies are also evolving very fast. So to summarize and to answer your question, I fully agree with Karen's presentation. But the problem is very complex, and there is no unique answer, I think, to the future of mining in Europe. It really depends on how we estimate the future demand, the future energy scenario, the way you use the energy, and so on. So we have to be prepared for sure, and the exploration is very important. There is no question about that. Now to go to the operational side is maybe more difficult, and there are economic constraints, very strong economic constraints.
So just to be clear, before we move on, and Karen had highlighted the social license being one of the critical asperities. So you're kind of saying, but the economic viability is equally or more or just slightly less? Is that?
Well, the economic viability is the first constraint. It's not possible to produce anything without making benefit. And the risk is that if you are not able to be competitive with foreign production, nobody will buy what you will produce. So that's very simple. So it's not viable on the long term.
Well, let's kind of, I think what we're going to do is kind of expand that out, and we'll definitely come back to that social license aspect in Europe, because that's a kind of key point. But I just wanted that idea of this been driven as much by global demand. You know, Europe's kind of response been driven by what's happening. Is bring in Kwasi, what's your take on Karen's outline? Is that something that you recognize?
Yeah, absolutely. If you we do need mining, and we do need a clean environment as well. So we engaged the industry a while back at Bloomberg NEF, and I think the basic question we wanted to ask the industry was that, what is the future of the electric vehicle market? And quite frankly, it was a very simple answer we got from the industry that we engaged with. They said, yes, we love electric vehicles, but we want to get it sustainably. And that's kind of a bold statement there. We want EVs, we want clean energy, but we want to do it sustainably. So we embarked on a series of research to try to identify from a mining perspective whether indeed the industry is doing it right, mining it sustainably, and most importantly, able to meet demand. So let's take lithium, for instance. If you look at lithium, 73% of current lithium capacity is in areas where there is water stress. Like the ability to get water is difficult, water supplies are dwindling. And basically, if you look at a lithium deposit, right, you've got two main sources. You've got the brine, which you get out of salt, and then you've got the hard rock. The problem is with the brine. So the problem with the brine is that you pump water from deep down the earth, bring it on the surface, and then evaporate the water. And if you look at that process alone, to get 1 ton of lithium, you have to evaporate about 70,000 liters of water. So that's quite a big problem. And that's just for lithium. Later on, I'll talk about the other metals. But primarily the point I'm making is that, yes, the consumers, end users, the industry want this clean energy transition, but if only it can be guaranteed that they will mine it sustainably. So yes, we need mining, but we have to do it right.
When you talk about the water stress there, are you talking about in Europe or in developing countries where we get most of those materials?
So 73% of the global supply of lithium. And out of that, if you break it down, so you've got the 4 main countries that currently produce lithium. You've got Chile, which leads, you've got Australia, you've got Argentina, and you've got China. So all of this are mixed in there. So you've got developing, you've got an emerging, and you've got a developed country. So it's kind of a mix in there. And if you talk about lithium, for instance, currently in Europe, there's no lithium production, but I'll come to that later.
A little bit in Southwest England, maybe starting.
Exactly, I was going to say a little bit. So keep your fingers crossed. But the point is that if you look at Europe's capacity, is nowhere near what expectations are. You know, Europe, for instance, if you take 2020, Europe is looking at selling about 1 million electric vehicles. That's quite significant, precisely 920,000. And Ian, do you know how much lithium you need to be able to produce 1 million electric vehicle? Give me a wild guess, number.
I have no idea.
All right, I'll tell you.
No idea.
50,000 metric tons. And you know Europe's current capacity? If the asset we have in Portugal manages to come online, you're looking at just 2,000.
Wow. Okay.
So take everything aside, you have 48,000 that would have to come elsewhere. Like even existing future European capacity is nowhere near what it would take to produce the 1 million electric vehicles that will be sold in Europe this year. So that's a big question.
Kwasi, thank you for that. I think we'll flip back to that. I noticed in the chat or the Q&A, there's a question that came through from Mario, and more of a provocation really. He says, so better dig somewhere else, easy license to operate laws, no care about the environment and social, which nicely takes us on to that broader aspect about the ramifications you'd mentioned about water stress and things like that. Maybe Georgette, can I bring you in to look at, you know, from your perspective as a country that kind of supplies minerals and metals into the chain, into the European chain, what's your take on Karen's perspective? Do you again recognize that, or do you kind of push back on certain things?
Well, thank you very much, Karen, for that presentation. And broadly speaking, and looking at the subject line, I believe that yes, mining, you know, it can help everybody. And we are supplying, the raw materials are available in Africa and we are supplying. But it's also important, I feel that it's important, apart from economic issues, it's important that if Africa or developing nations are the one doing the production, providing the raw materials, it's important that whatever social license, whatever ethical issues that apply elsewhere, we should all put in the maximum to make sure that where back home here in Ghana and in other African countries, we try as much as possible to adhere to the same kinds of ethical processes. So I think that it's important that we continue to supply. We continue to supply the raw materials. We want to supply the raw materials because I feel like it is an area, an industry that contributes a lot economically for African nations. It's a pity that Africa is stuck on the earlier part of the chain. We tend to do the exploration and the production, and once the raw material is out, it seems we are not doing as much. I think there are about 1,800 mines right now operating on the continent, varying levels of metals, varying different categories of metals. But it's important. We already have a lot of legacy issues. We already have a lot of environmental issues. If you follow the news on, for example, a country like Ghana, you would realize that we have a lot of environmental issues, especially in our small scale mining sector. And so it's important that this problem is not, it is not a problem that affects just our country. It's not a problem that affects just Africa. It's a global problem. So it's important that whoever the consumers are, take an interest in making sure that the processes are responsible. If they are responsible and we are able to create more jobs and use it to attain more of the SDGs, it solves a lot of problems for everybody globally. Less migration. Number one, less migration. The youth will get jobs to do. If you look at the workforce on the Africa continent as a whole, in small scale mining and artisanal small scale mining, you would realize that 40% of the workforce are women. So that is where my interest is in. And I do not want them to get out of the industry. I advocate for them to fully participate in the industry, but we want them to be doing so they don't get affected, health-wise, and they do not contribute to environmental degradation as well. I think about 2 hours from there is a company doing where I'm sitting right now. There is a company currently exploring lithium. So I was very interested in what Quincy was saying, trying to, I didn't know about how much water we need. And so, some of these issues, sometimes even communities do not know. Communities do not know how these are going to eventually affect them. And so it's very important that governments, consumers, communities, everybody, we come together to make sure that this definitely is done responsibly. And we have an opportunity. There is an opportunity for us to do better.
Great.
And so I think I'll stop here for a while.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I want us to mind.
Everyone, yeah. And I think we'll try and look back to some of those issues, maybe come tying in Olivier's question earlier on about whether this improving of ethical and environmental standards, will that end up producing more of a balance in terms of the economic kind of change. But I'd like to bring in Steve now. You've been very patient there, Steve. Thanks for that. Because that business about, the easy touch is do it somewhere else. But that somewhere else, often the perception is can get done with very light touch environmental and social kind of regulations. Thinking in terms of the environmental, which is your area, can you kind of comment really on Karen's take?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for the invitation and a great presentation as well from Karen, setting the stage for this discussion. It's actually really quite alarming, some of the statistics that she shared with us and how important it is to have this conversation. To me, it seems that this is really a case of a not in my backyard, a NIMBY, where there is a rejection of those types of practices of mining within the European community. And I think that the arguments that Olivier gives, while completely valid in terms of the economics behind it, also point to some other deeper challenges, which may be that there's a lack of implementation of the policies and approaches and regulations that we've come to expect and demand in Europe and in North America. And so it's not only importing these already somewhat processed resources from other places, but it's actually exporting the problems and the damage that come in terms of environmental impacts, as well as degradation to the climate. So partly what we need to do is price these resources appropriately, and if that means that we're going to have to pay more so that the places that are developing them, like Georgette is speaking to, then we should be prepared to, and not always drive for the absolute cheapest possible things that we can buy. Black Friday is a terrible example of this. And we should demand from those that produce the devices and things that we use that they're not made to become obsolete and that they can be recycled. And we should most importantly demand that we practice and we source from places that are mining responsibly. Mining responsibly entails things like ensuring very robust environmental and social impact assessments and adherence in the sense of the environmental community to the mitigation hierarchy, which is avoiding negative impacts where possible, and also mitigating them when we can, restoring those impacts, and if needed and absolutely necessary, offsetting them. To be responsible in mining, we have to look at having free, prior, informed consent of the local communities where mining is happening. These are basic practices that we would demand here at home, wherever that may be. So we should also demand that it's happening in the places where we're sourcing our metals and minerals from. We should ensure that mining supports local social and economic development and is also socially positive. Many of the impacts, again, that were being discussed by Georgette are cases where things are not socially positive. And importantly, in this day and age, ensure that the mining that is happening is climate neutral or even perhaps climate positive. Finally, I think there's a really important piece here, which is also looking at what are the plans for closure. While mining is a long-term endeavor, multiple decades, many times there are no plans for what is going to happen once the mine finishes. And so there are really key issues that affect livelihoods, community development, safety concerns around tailings, for example, that need to be strongly considered from the inception of a mining project. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And certainly some of those issues around the kind of life cycle of mines is something that the future shape of mining is going to touch on. I'd like to bring Karen in just a second, but there was a point that's come up in the Q&A on the chat, which is probably best to deal with right at this point with you, Steve, which is, it's about how do you overcome a lack of transparency in the industry? And I think that's really talking to what you're saying about, making sure that transparency operates, I guess, within the European realm, but also increasingly internationally. Could you just say a few words on that before I bring Karen in?
Sure, absolutely. And this is something that we exercise a lot, and there are a number of great initiatives out there that are trying to bring greater levels of transparency to the mining and metals world that showcase efforts that are underway that involve local stakeholders in those efforts. I manage an independent panel in Brazil that is providing advice to the restoration from a tailings dam collapse that occurred in 2015. And all of those processes need to be made publicly available and shared and engage stakeholders so that collectively as a society, we can make the decisions. And if those decisions are to go in a certain direction, impactfully, negatively to the environment or the climate, for example, at least we've taken them collectively as a society.
Thanks, Karen. I'd like to bring you back in, and you've heard some of the kind of responses there, and also to bring in something that you were talking about in Europe. We're kind of hampered by this kind of social license to operate in this aspect, but actually, and that maybe we should sort of kind of get some responsibility of those earlier parts of your snail diagram around the early parts. Someone just put a comment on from Dan saying, shouldn't producing countries reap the benefits of the downstream activity? So the other side of the snail getting more income, which I guess talks a little bit to Georgette's kind of point. But what's your take on what you've heard so far?
I mean, as a short answer, I'd say yes, they should reap some of the benefits. And so I think that we really need to, that's why I love the snail so much, because it's sort of, traditionally, we didn't think that much in value chains. Either you were like an exploration person and you did that, it has its own, business models, its own investors, and then the mining sector is different, own business models again, other investors, and it sort of continues down that value chain. And we need to connect that up, I think, and we need to make sure that the value that is really added sort of societally is matched by economic value that it may give to the people at the different parts of the value chain. Because I think it is one of the really, really big issues is that we basically in Europe, and as I was saying, we don't want to mine. It's because we don't actually need to, because it's cheaper for us to just buy this and then put it into products that we can then really sort of increase the value on, and then we can sell those. And we should need to with the consumption that we have. And again, it's not about being sort of nationalistic that everyone should be self-sufficient. It is really global responsibility that we should mine where it makes sense to mine from an environmental and financial and a people's sort of perspective. And then we should take that responsibility and we should make sure that people are rewarded. So I think that we do need to look at the business models for mining. And I think that the easiest way to do that, and sort of back to a point that I made in the snail, but also that Steve picked up on, is to make the OEMs, so the manufacturers, if they would love this, I think. If it's their responsibility that things are responsibly sourced, they will do that. And if it's their responsibility that it's designed so they can actually be recycled, or maybe even it's their responsibility that it's recyclable, then they will also do that, and it will be a level playing field. And so I think that we need to be much more strategic on policy and on what it is we want to achieve, which is, of course, these sustainable development goals. It's the green transition. That's what we want to achieve. So
there's something, I'm just looking at the chat, some great stuff coming in. So I'll maybe throw this towards Olivier, but other people could pick up if they want. It said, should we, and it follows on from Karen's point, should we be looking at the smelting and refining part of the value chain moving back to Europe? They're often the most environmentally impactful and capital intensive parts of the supply chain. I guess the implication being that it's okay to do that over there, but actually go back to the backyard. But Olivier, do you think that thing about bringing back those earlier parts of the value chain, the snail, is something that Europe really is thinking about?
Yeah, again, my answer is always the same. If it's economically viable and you can do it better at home, do it. But the question is whether it's possible or not. I can take the example of steel, for instance. Steel produced in China 10 years ago with coal was cheaper than recycled steel from Europe, produced with decarbonized electricity or low carbon electricity. So in that case, you cannot compete. If there is a problem of price, you have no solution. And I can add a few words about recycling also. Recycling is very important in developed countries, and it's a major challenge, I think, in Europe, where we have a very high level of consumption and an equally high yearly flow of end-of-life products. But again, the difficulty of recycling is the same as that of primary extraction. It's cost. The cost of recycling depends on the products to recycle and the metal you want to recover from this product. So the lower the content of a metal, the higher the energy and cost to recover it. If the metal to be recovered is in an alloy or in small pieces that are difficult to separate from each other, the recycling work will be so large that the cost of recycling will be prohibitive. And this is why the recycling rate of rare metals is very low right now. And in that case, of course, we will still or continue to buy virgin metal instead of recycling what we have at home. This is a specific problem, for instance, regarding the digital and the communication devices with very short lifetimes. So the cumulative amount of metal contained in the end-of-life product is huge, but it is diluted in each product. So not recycling makes no sense from a resource and environmental perspective, of course, but it makes sense from a short-term economic perspective, simply because the cost of recycling is prohibitive, and it's always the same problem for the whole value chain, I think.
I just wanted to come in there about whether we're the kind of new change of the new mineral transition is changing some of the classic theories, and particularly something came through in the Q&A around batteries and battery materials that I'd like to send to Kwasi, which is saying that, you know, classically the early part of the supply chain wasn't very profitable, but in things like batteries and battery materials, more value is embedded in raw materials than later on. Is that true? Is that going to change things, this focus on batteries?
So can you repeat the question? Like more value?
The more value in raw materials, because of batteries requiring the raw materials, there's actually more values in that early part of the supply chain than there was previously.
Yeah, so yes, there's more value in those raw materials than there was previously, but then if you look across the whole value chain, yeah, there's certainly more value at the downstream level compared to the upstream level. And I think we did some back of the envelope calculation, and then what we came to the conclusion, so globally, the market value of the raw materials bit of the business is about, I think, $7 billion. But then if you're looking at the market value of the further downstream, that is the electric vehicle production, where the Teslas and the Volkswagen and the other companies sit, you are looking at somewhere in the area of $1 trillion. So you look at it, clearly there's a lot more value. And yeah, you can even look at the market value of Tesla. It's much higher than almost every mining company that looks at battery raw materials, the market value combined. So it's certainly, if you swim further downstream, the opposite, which is the opposite, you get more value. But then coming back to your previous question on whether Europe should actually have more refinery oil. So we did an interesting piece of work, which I'm proud to say that was one of the first in the world, to look at the global lithium supply chain. Like, which country is ready? Everybody's talking about building their domestic capacity. Indonesia wants to rule, China wants to rule, Europe wants to rule. They've set up, EU has been quite active in that space. America wants to take up. So we were like, you know, take a step back. Who is leading the market? And we looked at 5 factors. Do you have raw materials? Have you got cell or component like battery manufacturing capacity? What are the kind of regulations, environment regulations, policies, infrastructure, and innovation in your country? 4, are you environmentally responsible? And number 5, if you produce the batteries today, do you have an end demand to use it? And unsurprisingly, guess the country that came first? China. Second, I think Japan or Korea. Second and third, Japan and Korea, and the rest, the usual suspect. European countries, we sampled them. Overall, we looked at 25 countries. So I think 9 European countries, including the UK in the ranking. If you look at Europe as a region, Europe topped. But then individually, the countries did not do quite well on the ranking, with the exception of the UK and Germany. And what stood out is that if you look at factors like environment, Europe stands very tall. If you look at factors like infrastructure innovation, once again, you've got Europe there. And you look at end demand, it's Europe. And what drives all these 3 things is very good policies, okay? But when you take raw materials and cell manufacturing capacity, that is when China actually takes the lead. And it's simply because of a decision their government took 10 years ago that, I mean, how do you call it? Resources are given by nature. If you don't have cobalt, you don't have it. There's nothing you can do. But what you can do is that you can invest in the downstream, for example, our refinery. So that's what China started doing. China doesn't mine a single ton of cobalt, but 73% of cobalt mined globally ends up in China before it's distributed across the world. So certainly there's value in building downstream capacity, even if you don't have that resources. And we believe that those are some of the strategic moves Europe can take in order to increase its competitiveness in the battery ranking space. But also to sort of wrap it up, I wanted to give people a picture of how the global supply chain works. So let's take a metal.
That's really helpful. I'm just conscious we're kind of 5 minutes, and I want to bring Steve, and I also want to come back to Georgette as well. But Steve, I think that there was a question earlier on about would we mine in policy biosphere reserves. I wonder if I can broaden that a little bit into, what are there the no-go areas for mining in either Europe, and should we have a different policy of that, whether it's Europe or rest of the world? What are the barriers in that sense?
Well, a number of companies have made commitments to not explore for mine in World Heritage Sites, for example. So all members of the International Council on Mining Metals have made that commitment to not do that. Those are no-go areas. And increasingly, companies are starting to enhance or respect the levels of protection that are afforded to other protected areas around the world. It's also, though, really important that the government plays an active role in enhancing and enforcing their own regulations in this regard, because many times it's not really the case of the companies per se. It's where governments have put forward licenses and concessions to be able to extract minerals and metals. So there's a growing movement within the conservation community to seek areas that are off limits for these types of activities, but it is very challenging, particularly when there are opportunities for development, for economic development, and the control of these resources is often put within the ministries in government that have far more power than those that manage the environment or social considerations.
Thanks for that. Georgette, just that we've talked around quite a lot of the issues, and in some ways, implicit in all of this is most of those raw materials are coming from Asia or Africa, or just from your perspective, in terms of the changes, what would your take be on, should Europe produce more of its own material that it consumes, or should it actually try to focus more attention on a balancing up act, really, to make sure there's better investment, better ethics, etc., more broadly? Do you want to take us back into that, and maybe something around social license, because we think of social license, as Karen mentioned, being very acute in Europe, but I mean, what are the aspects of social license, environmental license in Ghana or in Africa as well?
I think that my tendency is to go for the second option, that we should balance. We should balance it, and we should help in making sure that what is happening in other countries is being done in the right manner, especially the environment, and especially to environment, especially to remunerating people well for what they are doing. So environmental degradation, I think, is key, and reclamation, making sure that the environment gets back as close as possible to what it was, and water pollution, all of those things are very important. And I think that it's the consumer holds a really big stake that can actually influence policy in developing countries. And so it's very important that the ethical reasoning, we go on that side, on the side of ethical, and making sure that it's mining responsibly. That's my take. So balance. Thank
you very much. I'm seeing Karen nodding away, so I think I'll just go. We've only got a couple of minutes left. If we just go around the group, just that same question, is it Europe first kind of thing, or is that actually trying to globally balance out? Karen, you were nodding away with Georgette there.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I like the image of the consumer with a big stick. I think that again, I think we should mine where it makes sense to mine, and I'm sure that there are places in Europe where it probably does make sense to mine. So I think we should balance, just as Georgette said, and really be more concerned about doing it right wherever we're doing it, and not. I think we are in a point in time where we are more interested in sustainability. We're thinking about what we're eating, all those kinds of things. It's time to take that mindset also into when we consume, things like this, and actually make good choices there. And in a way, that's sort of taking the social license to operate. Traditionally, we often talk about communities where you mine, and making sure that community welcomes your mining and benefits from your mining. And while that obviously is extremely important, it hasn't always been the case. I think social license to operate really should be elevated to a societal level, that we acknowledge what our demands are and why we have them, and then we find solutions that are sustainable globally.
So it's more that invitation to operate rather than just simply the license to operate. Very, very quickly, maybe Olivier, what's your kind of take on that duality?
Yeah, well, it's a difficult question actually, but
in 30 seconds or less, then.
Yeah, I think it's also important that the developing countries have the opportunity to make benefit from this from their local extraction. The trade in mineral industry and oil and gas between China and Africa was $2 billion in 5 years ago. So it's a money that can be invested in the country, which is in course of development, and of course to also to build its infrastructure.
Fantastic, thank you. Kwasi, very quickly.
Yeah, so very quick. I mean, I talked about us not even having enough lithium to meet. What I did not add was that Europe needs 9,000 metric tons of cobalt, current capacity 2,800. It needs 52,000 of nickel, current capacity 47,000. So even if we relied on Europe's capacity, is not enough. So certainly we'll have to look elsewhere. And like I agree with Karen and Georgette, the consumer has the big stick. When the EU or when Europe moves, the world moves. And if you look at the supply chain policy that the Europe wrote, for instance, it has changed cobalt mining in the DRC and around the world. So when Europe moves, the world moves. And I expect Europe to take the lead on making mining better around the world.
Thank you very much. And final word to kind of Steve there. What's your...
Sure. Well, we live on a planet with finite resources, and we need to start acting like it.
Nice and succinct there. Thank you very much. I completely heartily agree. Listen, that brings us to the end of the session. Thank you for everyone. Of the 270, I think we had 75 we had at the point. Lots of questions. We didn't get round to them all. We are trying to answer them in other areas, but I'd love to thank the panel, Karen, Georgette, Olivier, Steve, and Kwasi, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much from me.
Thank you.